It's season 8 and I have some cracking guests lined up. We'll be diving into all things leadership, teamwork, engagement, mental well-being and high performance. We have the conversations that matter about putting the human factor back into business, because when we get people right, we get business right. If you want to find out more about how to develop an experience that brings out the best in people, get in touch. And if you like the idea of building your leaders, managers and culture, one experiment at a time, Leadership Labs may well be for you. Check out details in the show notes. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist and psychotherapist and founder of It's Time for Change. Thank you for joining me on Beyond the Water Cooler. So Nick O'Neill, who's Chambers Director at Oriel Chambers, is a big advocate for mental health in the legal industry with a particular passion for men's mental health. And he's joining me today to put a spotlight on that particular topic after a big focus on men's mental health. So welcome, Nick, to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So this is the first time we have spoken after recommendations and me reading various posts of yours on LinkedIn. And I think it's fair to say that you're what I would consider, very passionate, but you're a bit of an expert in this space in terms of mental health around men in the legal industry. You're very influential in that space, and you've been doing a lot of work in that particular area. And what I'm hoping people get from this conversation is how to think differently about a subject that is talked about a huge amount, in my opinion, and not a lot tends to happen in terms of change in some organizations, particularly traditional industries. And from what I know about law, which is not very much, I see it's a very traditional organization. And I remember, so I looked at your website, or the website for Oriel Chambers, and it says modern barristers, traditional values. And I think it's really interesting that it's that traditional values, but actually your focus on mental health isn't a typical traditional area of concern in your industry, in your organization. So I'm really interested to know how that connection has come in terms of going from law and thinking about how we just do things in this industry and how we just get on with things, and this is what it's like here, and how you've put a spotlight on actually it can be quite different and we need to be a bit more modern in terms of our thinking. So I would love to hear from you a little bit first of all about actually what your role entails. So it sounds a very grand title. I have no idea what that actually means day to day. So tell us a bit more about your role and how you got into that.
It's not. It certainly isn't as grand as it sounds. No, it probably is actually. So I'm the director of Chambers. Started off industry very long time ago, seems now. Became a young lawyer. Worked in civil litigation for a long time. Worked up the industry up to partner, and was managing a number of teams in a medium-sized national practice. So I was managing in London, Warrington and Wirral, and was enjoying the management more than the law. So spoke to my then senior partner and said, I'd like to train formally into management. So I did an MBA in Nottingham Trent. And then realised when I finished the MBA that the reality is if I was going to grow and learn, I needed to move, because where I was, I'd been there for 15 years and I was part of the furniture, and you're never going to grow and learn if you just stay where you are. So moved to a number of private practice law firms for a 4-year period. Really interesting, very different organisational cultures and processes and people management. And then I wanted to have more of a purely management role. So I went to the Wirral for 5 years, Wirral Council, where I was the governance and legal practice manager for 5 years, basically looking after quite a large legal team for 5 years. And then basically it's so challenging in local government with budget constraints. We just didn't, I didn't have the resources to take the organisation where I wanted it to go to, and realistically, a little bit selfishly, what I wanted to achieve personally and professionally. So an opportunity came to come and manage at the bar. So it's basically a operations director in a barrister's chambers. So I've been here for 3.5 years now. Fabulous set, lovely people, really challenging. Ticks a lot of the boxes for me. So yeah, very settled, very happy, very busy.
Yeah, I can imagine. I love that whole when you describe it, you were sort of doing law and then you realize that actually you really loved management, because I hear a lot from people who are managers who are like, oh, I hate being a manager. I want to go back to doing what I used to do. So actually to have when people have an opportunity to step into that management space and they love it and they're good at it, it's like actually we need more people like that stepping into that role and letting the others step back to actually the stuff that they're good at focusing on.
Yeah, the profession is slowly but surely moving into that space. A lot of the larger firms have recognised that sort of historically you'd promote lawyers into managerial positions because literally they were going up a corporate ladder, but they didn't have the skill sets or the desire to become managers. So you sort of were almost wasting excellent resources you had that were brilliant lawyers and taking them away from what they were good at. And over about the last 5 to 10 years, that's been recognised a lot more. And now there's different pathways in the larger organisations, the medium and smaller size organisations. It's more of a struggle for them simply because they don't have that level of resource to have people just do a management role and just do a lawyer role. You really need to do both. So that's a real challenge for the profession at the moment.
So how did you get interested in mentoring? Because I know you're when I was reading a little bit about you and your interest in coaching and mentoring and mental health, how did that specifically come about after, moving into sort of management and the bar and so on? You've kind of took that a step further. How did that happen?
I mean, in terms of mental health and mentoring, I struggled with my own mental health in my 20s. Just coming out of university, I had a relationship breakdown, and my granddad died. And I was lucky in that my mum my late mum was a therapist. So she signposted me to a therapist, a lady called Anita Cantor, who bizarrely was a pal of mine's mum. And I just hadn't put two and two together. When I arrived at the house and thought, I recognise this house. But anyway, she became a real sort of mentor for me in mental health. I finished my counselling sessions with her, and she said, "You're really engaged with this sort of process with counselling. I think you'd be really good at it." And so I studied with her, and she was the director of an Adlerian group in Liverpool. So I studied with that group for 3 years, and there was a bit of a sliding doors moment as to whether or not to stay in the law or move into psychotherapy. I'd always loved, I know he's a bit of a controversial character now, but I'd always loved Woody Allen movies growing up, and I loved the concept in America of everyone having a therapist or a shrink, as they call it. And I couldn't quite understand how or why the UK didn't have that culture. And I was quite, late teens, early 20s. And then gradually realised that kind of culture was completely at odds with the, UK stiff upper lip. Mentoring and coaching, I was quite, when it was that sliding doors moment, I was quite far down the road to become a lawyer. I was a trainee solicitor moving into being a solicitor. So it was that sliding doors moment, and I decided to stick with being a lawyer, which I really enjoyed. And then I had a few bumps in the road with my own mental health in work, and approached a charity that was called Salt Care, that is now Law Care. Had some advice on an issue, and I thought, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. and then was reading the Law Society Gazette a long time ago when it was paper, and they were asking for law care volunteers to support my peers in the industry. So I volunteered, and about 14 years later, I'm still volunteering for law care. I'm now a champion, which means I do a lot of seminars and talks on mental health. And I've gradually grown my own brand in the space, and have my own presentations now that I'm invited regularly by law societies and universities to talk about mental health in the industry. I have more of a focus over the last year on men's mental health. And at the same time, about 2 or 3 years ago, I did the ILM level 5 coaching and began to build a coaching portfolio. So I've got a client portfolio in coaching where I coach on career development and career growth. So I've really sort of grown into this space almost organically in a lot of respects, but I'm very comfortable here. I really enjoy it. I find it fascinating, meeting so many amazing people, challenging, and onward and upwards in a lot of respects.
Yeah, and I think that when it happens organically, it speaks volumes in terms of that happens because it's your natural skill set and it's your passion and it's about opportunities. And you see too many people who decide they want to do something and they're not necessarily cut out for it, but they're determined to make it work. So they
Yeah,
kind of got their nose down. And actually, when it happens, because you're able to, you're in a position where you're able to pull together all your different strengths and skills and blend them. I mean, it's like that's magic. So that's an awesome resource for those people who are lucky enough to access law care, which sounds like an awesome organisation. So tell
oh,
me, a bit more then about what you're seeing then, particularly as the challenges, and it might be through your work with law care or more widely, just your experience around, particularly for men and their mental health.
it's with men. I mean, if you pull it back all the way, it's a culture, societal culture issue. With regard to law, it has always historically attracted alpha characters, where the mental health conversation remains a perceived weakness that can, damage careers or limit careers. And in the UK, it's still quite an alien concept to discuss mental health, especially with men. We're getting a lot better at it, but society and the culture needs to change, and change of that magnitude takes time. We've got a lot of help from public figures like, Prince William, for example, and a lot of industry, a lot of film stars and musicians are all engaging, and it's being embraced, especially by the last couple of generations. So change of that magnitude takes time. It will be driven by the current generations and they're a lot more comfortable in this space. It's their world, it's their space. It's my generation, I find, that is where the real barriers are. I don't find it to be much engagement from my generation, and that's been a real challenge.
And do you think that barrier around that kind of generational difference is because of the stigma around it? Because as you say, the younger people coming into the workforce are much more in tune with their emotional and mental health needs and what they're expecting of businesses and so on. So they're changing, and it'll be interesting to kind of fast forward 10 years and see how work is quite different then, hopefully. But do you think at the moment it's all around those challenges, those barriers around the stigma, and around what we're expecting people to be and how they're expected to behave, and and still having that sort of stiff upper lip and being sort of quite alpha and so on. Is that what you're seeing?
I think it's history, isn't it? I think, and it's a huge topic in the internet has opened communication to everyone. So whereas you'd be very confined to your own peer groups or your own working groups, where the conversations would be in those groups. And say for the law, for example, it would be, culturally, it's that dominant alpha characters. There was a lot of male dominance in the profession. And with the dawn of the internet and the availability of information and communication around topics like mental health, that generation has immediately embraced mental health as being part of the conversation. It's completely normalized. It's the older generation who, ironically, are in a lot of managerial positions. If you wanted to put an age demographic on it, you're probably looking at about 40, between 40 to mid 50s. They're still in that. They're still working through that space to understand what their approach is to mental health and whether or not they're willing or able to change their approach. And then you've got the generation coming directly under. And as you say, if we fast forward 10 years, it'd be, and perhaps even longer, it will be a very different place, especially in our profession. It's not something that we can rush. I've been frustrated about it quite a few times, but I've had to roll back and understand that it is very, very layered in terms of complex cultural issues that you just can't unpick in 5 minutes, and this thing will take a long time.
And as you say, it's a big change. You have to have a lot of people on board. So how is the bar going about addressing those challenges? So sort of in that sort of 40 to 55, if you're looking at age demographics, how are you going about addressing that resistance to opening your arms, people opening their arms and saying, actually, yeah, we need to fully embrace this mental health stuff and do something about it?
The bar has been very good. It has a resource called Wellbeing Matters that is available on the Bar Council's website. There's an accreditation process where you can apply for a certificate as a Chambers, which is great. The conversation's progressing, so you've got numerous sets applying for this accreditation, and they get recognised on the Bar Council website. There's a real, with men's health at the bar, it is a real challenge. It's almost on steroids because you're all self-employed at the bar, so it's that sort of quite isolated role. So you had the isolation of the role when you're in Chambers, but after COVID, everyone left and everyone works from home now, especially at the bar. So many barristers upped and left their physical chambers, went home, never came back. Why would you? You're self-employed, you've got an office at home, it's very nice. You only need to travel to go to court. Why would you come back to a barrister's physical chambers? So that isolation was almost on steroids. So you're on your own. And then if you're struggling with your mental health, you've got that knock on, what will my peers think? What will my peers think of it? Barristers love a gossip as well. So there's that fear of, are they talking about me? There's no physical engagement. It's all WhatsApp groups and social media. So it just ramps it up. And then to top it all off, if you're struggling with your mental health and you're self-employed, you've got what will my clients think of me? These are the people who are giving me work. If they think I'm struggling mentally, they're not going to want to give me work. They're going to go elsewhere. So again, you've got these layers of fear to engage with mental health and to support, almost to support yourself in the conversation.
So how do you start to unpick those layers? Because it's, what you're describing it is complex, and because there are multiple layers. And I think it's really interesting to think about how, as an organization, thinking about other leaders who are in their organizations going, it is complex. We have got people working from home, and we've got people who aren't open about their mental health because of potential consequences for them from their peers or clients or whatever. Where do people start in terms of thinking about that differently to try and change that set of beliefs and those behaviours?
Wow, it's difficult. It really is difficult. You're changing, or you're looking or attempting to change something that is so big. Keep talking. We had a huge a COVID well-being and mental health. We were basically drowning in webinars about mental health.
Yeah.
And you came out of COVID and you were almost like, oh, thank God we don't have to listen to any more well-being, webinars or anything of that nature. And the irony was that we were coming out of a situation where we all thought we were going to die in some way. So a huge stress period in our lives. And then you come out of the period and you've got that latent stress that everyone's still retained for a period. And it was probably then that mental health was so important to talk about it, because we were all coming into this, new norm of life and society after having this horrendous period in our lives. So to keep that level of conversation going and that momentum going was initially a big challenge. I think we're coming around the curve now, and the conversation is back. It's a lot more structured. It's not perpetual. There's nuances to it now, and talking about like things like men's mental health. My view is encouraging group engagement. You've got things like Andy's Man's Group, which is an incredible resource nationally, that I'm really supportive of and passionate about. And you've seen men's health groups coming up in places like the army, which is places where there is that, again, a not dissimilar alpha world. So it's that momentum, and I think for me, it's always hard not to try and rush the agenda. Work through the agenda gradually with the people you want to engage with, and understand how they want to be communicated with, what they want to talk about, and have them almost drive the bus. So their involvement will help with the progression, rather than it being an almost directive approach. You should do this or you should do that. Levels of engagement, and I think that is working a lot better.
I love that you just said, Nick, because I think that whole understanding what people need and then building around their needs is so important. That I'm quite anti-ticking boxes. I'm very anti-ticking boxes. And I'm very resistant to kind of these packages that people take off a shelf and say, this is what you need to do and you'll all feel better, because we've got to understand what the particular group that people are engaging with and what they need, and and it's not just the content, it's actually how they want to engage with that whole process, and not rushing it. Like you
Yeah,
said, it's you people tend to have this, I've got 6 weeks to deliver a program. I've got to make sure I cover all this stuff. And it's like you can't, with stuff like that's involving how humans feel and behave, and actually feeling safe in a space to open up and have the conversations. You can't put a time on that. You can't say, right, in 6 weeks we've got to, be tick that box, move on. We've got to have
yeah,
space for people just to come along and actually potentially for a few sessions, whatever they look like, just to listen and just to observe and just to understand that it is a safe space, and that there is a sense of camaraderie in it. And I can talk about things. I can take my mask off and I can trust these people here. And that all takes time.
yeah, yeah. I've done a lot of appraisal work in management over the last 10 years, and have understood the listening, how important the listening side of it was. Appraisals and human resources and engagement with human beings. Listening is so important over a period, and again, not rushing the process. So if you engage with people and let them, as I will say, let people drive the bus, and it'll work, and it will develop organically into the direction that you ultimately want it to go in. But at the same time, if it moves in other directions, it becomes a learning process as well. So it works, and I agree with you 100%. I detest tick boxes, mental health tick. It drives me absolutely mad, and I rail against that conversation when we have it in our industry, because it just doesn't work.
So are you seeing, because obviously your passion is around men's mental health, are you seeing differences between how women in the legal industry are addressing or dealing and speaking about mental health compared to men? And is that, if there is still a gap, is that gap beginning to reduce now that there is a bit more of a focus on keeping that momentum up around having the conversations and feeling okay to talk about mental health?
Men and women are completely different beasts. You've got to approach the conversation differently. I've been to sessions about men's health with women, and men just clam up, and then women dominate the conversation because they're so more comfortable in that space. And it's one of my bugbears when you set up a men's health group. My view, rightly or wrongly, I think it's right. Don't have women involved because they'll dominate, because they're very good at it. They're very passionate about it. It makes perfect sense. And I've been to a few of these groups, and my feedback has always been, as controversial as it may sound, and it does sound controversial a little bit, don't have women in the conversation, because what you really want is you want men to engage, and you want men to drive the conversation. If it's a men's group, get them to do the legwork. Don't bring women in to almost make it, because men will just take a back seat and step back and go, oh, women, they're far better at their emotion, talking about their emotions than we are. We'll let them drive the bus. So my view is, take women out of the conversation. Women embrace the mental health conversation, and men will always see it as women's domain, with the industry historically led by women, as I mentioned earlier. And that is a challenge that we face with regard to male engagement. A couple of years ago, I went to a seminar where I was talking, and there were 80 women and 2 men. And it was about mental health generically. I was invited to International Women's Day to talk about mentoring a few years ago. And the energy in the room was insane. It blew me away. There was like two men and about 500 women. And I absolutely loved it. And I actually found myself being quite jealous of how far women are. There was conversations around mental health, the Me Too movement, women in industry. It was just fabulous. And I couldn't imagine men in that environment having that level of energy in those conversations. So we're just going back to your question about where we are with regard to men and women. There's still a natural gap between the way we approach the conversation. I think men are a little bit closer, but the generation, again, going back to the generation, the younger generation, are so much closer together, because you'll have young men and young women, and put them in an environment. You could have a group of young men and young women, and it would be a very equal conversation.
Yeah.
If you had my age in the room, it wouldn't happen.
You know what? You'll make me think about. I've had some conversations with people around advocacy. So for in leadership. So actually, how can men support women to get into more leadership positions? And what you were just saying about actually keeping men's groups just men, and so that the women don't end up dominating. I wonder if there's something around what women can potentially do to support men in the mental health space. So is it just about staying out of the way and letting men get on with it? Or is there anything proactive that women can do to support men and enable them to feel able to speak up more, or express what they need, or whatever it is? It'd be curious to know from your point of view.
Yeah, I think it's encouragement, and and not helping men of a certain generation. I think we are. I think we are talking about a generational issue. I don't think it's a generic men issue. It's a generational issue. Young men are phenomenally comfortable in talking in this space. It's the older generation that are so have that ingrained perceived stoicism in them, that they don't need to talk about their mental health, and there's so much society is unpicking so much of that now with men of a certain age and a certain generation understanding that they can talk about their mental health and it is healthy, and mental health is health. So I think it's about gentle encouragement. I do think it's about letting men have these groups like the Andy's Man's group, the group that we run. And it's not, these groups aren't about keeping women out. They're about helping men with their own emotions. And I think if we get this level of momentum going over years and years and years, you'll see a generational shift gradually, because the youngsters are fine, they'll be fine, don't worry about them. But it's the older generation that are the ones that need the help. I mean, the group I run, I have a lot of young men from 20s to 30s, and they absolutely fly through the sessions. And it's the older men who need a little bit of encouragement and cajoling to get moving along.
So I know you if I think I'm right in saying this, that you wellbeing was on the agenda at the Bar Leadership and Wellbeing Conference in April,
Yes.
which was great to see that that was on the agenda. I'm curious to know if who was at that conference in terms of who was engaging with that, who was listening to that, because I think having that on an agenda at such an event really raises the profile of that as well, and hopefully reaches different generations.
It was phenomenally encouraging. One of the things I really did notice, there was a lot of men there. It was literally a 50-50 split, which is unheard of in our profession, when you're running a conference about mental health. It was in London, so I'm sure that had something to do with it. I found in the city there's a lot better level of engagement than there is in the regions. There was real engagement and there was real passion about the conversations that we were having. I'm hoping to work with the Institute of Barristers, Clerks, and the Legal Practice Managers Association to talk to them about men's health as well, because they both, representatives approached me afterwards and said, great conversations. There was a senior clerk there who talked about his issues with alcohol, and it was one of those not a dry eye in the house, deep breath moments to hear these men talking so bravely and freely about their challenges in an industry, especially at the bar and the clerking side of things, where alcohol was such a massive part of business and engagement with clients and marketing. I thought it was brilliant, and I took a lot away from it. Trying to keep the momentum going, as you know, after these seminars is always hard. You have that initial energy, and then you've got to be careful that you don't let the good stuff escape. So really trying hard as an industry and engaging with the people that we've met to keep the conversation moving along.
So I think it's really interesting because that, you're clearly highlighting the value in those ongoing conversations and keeping the momentum going. And that requires time and space to be able to do that. And I'm really aware that lots of industries they use the fact that they have billable hours as a barrier to being able to engage with activities that are about mental health and well-being, because obviously it takes them away from what they could be doing to be able to bill clients. So I'm curious to know what your advice would be, or how you go about reassuring people that that's not an issue, and that actually putting time aside for people to invest in their own well-being and mental health and that of their peers is a good use of time, even if it's not billable time.
Yeah. There's a great saying, isn't there? And I don't know who said it, but it was said a long time ago that your greatest asset is your people.
Mm.
So you look after your people and the rest will follow. And I really do believe it is that simple. My advice would be to, I understand the concept of billing and billable hours because I was part of that industry and still am in a lot of respects. And in terms of the structure, it is needed. There can be some tweaking, but ultimately you need, as an industry, because I run a business, you need billable hours to factor in so you can run a business. But it's the flip side to that is understanding the people who are undertaking the work. You need to look after them. You need to, understand what makes them tick. There's an amazing guy called Charles Handy who wrote a book many years ago called Understanding Organizations. And he talks a lot about psychological contracts and individuals you will always have a psychological contract with your employer. My psychological contract with my employer is I have a wife and 2 kids, therefore I need to have a job that works so I can see my kids, pay the bills, and so that's where I am in my life.
Mm.
Pre-kids, it was very different. When I was single, it was very different. So it's understanding your people and what their drivers are in life as well as in work. And the current and next generation will demand that mental health is front and center. If you don't engage with these people in that space, they won't come and work for you. Or even worse, you'll lose them. So you have a generation now that is coming through, thousands and thousands and thousands of young people who will demand that mental health is front and center as part of their employment.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a conversation I was having yesterday with Gemma Ellison of Heart Leadership and Chris Chamberlain of Guernsey Mind about sort of plausible deniability and about how many leaders are still denying there is a need for this focus. It's like, well, actually, our organisation's fine, or we can explain away specific issues and we can pass the buck on something else or someone else. We're fine here, and I think it's really interesting hearing what you're saying, because if someone say the people who get it understand that people are the greatest asset, like, and they will do the right thing by their people because they get that. But there is still a huge number of people who just still turn a blind eye to that. They still don't get the need to look after their people. And it's with the conversation we were having yesterday is about how you convince those people to really take a different look and not, to challenge their own perceptions, which when so many people who have those views are quite stuck to them, like, actually, we're fine here, our company's fine. They're just not cut out for the job if they're not coping. As an organization, we're fine. As leaders, we're awesome. It's like, actually, how do you help them turn the spotlight on themselves and look in the mirror?
But they've got to want to change, haven't they?
Yeah.
You've got to say that we're inviting consultants in to have that very conversation. They've got to have the appetite, because if the appetite isn't there,
It'll never
and
change.
lawyers, Lisa, hate being told what to do. It doesn't. If you go in and go, you're doing it wrong, you'll get shown the door straight away. It doesn't work. McKinsey the consultants in America do loads of work in this space, and it is showing the bottom line will improve if you change, and that those type of people who are very focused on commercial, we're all focused on commercial success, but the ones who are almost tunnel vision when it comes to commercial success, they will only move their thought process to dealing with conversations like mental health and looking after your people in different ways if they see the financial benefits of that strategy. So it's approaching, as you know, there's many ways to skin a cat, and it's approaching those conversations differently, but there needs to be that want.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's the joke about, I can't remember how it goes, something like how many psychologists it takes to change a light bulb, and it's only one, but they've really got to want to do it.
Yeah.
And it's that it is, I think people are so convinced that they've got to try and change everyone's minds, and if someone's not ready to change, you can't change them. You can introduce lots of evidence, you can present lots of ideas that might help them start to just think differently, consider a different position to their own. But they've got, it's almost the pre-change state in terms of actually just feeling a little bit uncomfortable with my own beliefs. But until they start to see something that's a bit more attractive, or there's a reason to rethink my set of beliefs, they're not going to do that. And I think McKinsey's a great reference. I'm going to put a resource in the show notes, which is around a report I think was written last year or maybe the year before. I think it was last year. That was written by a group of financial directors around the return on investment in investing in well-being and investing in people. And it got a lot of interest because it was written by FDs and
Yeah,
not your HR or well-being people who everyone's very quick to dismiss as, well, of course they're going to say that. So it is, as you say, it's about the bottom line, which finally this evidence started to, pull together some of the case studies and say, actually, here are some numbers. If you're not looking at it for ethical reasons, you're not morally trying to do the right thing, then look at the numbers. It can impact.
yeah. And McKinsey talk about culture, organisational culture as well, massively in how important, if you are changing that dynamic, having them understand that the organisational culture shift will need to happen as well, and again that takes time. You've got subculture layers, all of these things. If you and what you said about FDs being involved in the conversation, you'd sit up immediately if you had that thought process where you are very commercially focused. If an FD says, if you change your business approach slightly to do this, and it will improve the bottom line, it's a no-brainer, and they'll be on the bus before you know it. So it's just how to approach the conversation.
So tell us a bit more then about the Merseyside's Legal Men's Wellbeing Group. How that actually came about. I'm assuming that's because of your interest in it, and potentially is that the same version that is going in Scotland with huge success?
Yes. So with Lorca, I've been talking about men's health. Nick Bloy, who's very prevalent in our industry, he's an ex-lawyer, brilliant guy. He led an initiative for Lorca that I was involved with. Met the young lawyers from Scotland, and they were talking about a men's health group, and I thought, what a brilliant idea, but was very busy with my own role here. So I parked it for a while, and they launched theirs last year, their men's health group in Scotland through the Law Society of Scotland. So I went along to one of their sessions. Again, was blown away by the engagement. There was about 20 guys there, all different ages, from different places in the profession. Fabulous engagement, really friendly, welcoming, no judgmental conversation. It was just, it was great. So I spoke to a few of my peers in Merseyside about setting up a group, and we worked to set it up, and we launched in January this year. It's great. It's exciting. There's great levels of interest and engagement. Really supportive. I describe it as a supportive learning environment with reverse mentoring in there, with some of the young lawyers involved. We're beginning to get more and more people involved. We've got some law students, we've got senior lawyers, we've got junior lawyers, we've got people from the legal cost profession involved. and it's been great. It's been great. We've had some cracking, interesting topics.
What sort of
Uh,
topics have you had?
um, Happiness, which was a really, really funny topic. Happiness in work and what that looks like. Our old friend imposter syndrome, which we could have talked for weeks about that. Because of my coaching background as well, talking about professional goals and how what they look like for people, and how you find a lot of people in the industry are just lost in this sort of
Mm,
career pathway, and are just meandering along without having professional goals, and how it makes you a lot how it makes your life, professional life, a lot more structured if you do have specific goals that you're aiming for. It's been, honestly, it's been a joy, Lisa. It's been great to be involved with. I just sit back and let the conversation develop with a few prompts,
mm.
and yeah, it's great to be part of.
But I love the fact that you're talking about things like, imposter syndrome. So again, I hear a lot of people talking about that, but it's predominantly women who will put their hands up and confess that. So to have men talking with other men and saying, actually, I experienced that. Talk about topics like happiness. If I speak to I have to talk about a lot to guys about happiness, they'd be like, oh, I'm not sure. What's that really? Is that really relevant? And actually, I was talking to someone who the Alliance of Independent Agencies, who have a festival of happiness every year. So I was a speaker at it last year, and we were just talking about the event for this year. And they're like, we think we're going to call it something different. And it's really interesting because there's that word happiness is like a bit like Marmite. Some people like that's what it's all about. If people are happy, then they have good mental health well-being, they perform well. It's like, what's not to love about that? And some people say just it's just so it's so vague. It's so like it's not business.
But the irony is, it is business, and what is, we were talking about, what is happiness in work? What does happiness look like for you in work? And the conversation was just flowing. Imposter syndrome. Everyone in the room. We were all obviously on teams, but everyone in the room has struggled with imposter syndrome at some stage in their career, and it
But
was
that
great.
is, yeah, that's a great admission, though, isn't it? Because that's the reality that pretty much everyone has, but no one wants to confess that. No one wants to open up about that.
And you felt, I think everyone felt, it was almost like a weight off their shoulders that there was like 8 people all talking about imposter syndrome. Well, if these guys have all struggled with imposter syndrome, it must be something that's quite normal. Ergo, when I'm next faced with imposter syndrome, I'll approach it with a slightly more gentle approach, and I'd be a little bit more gentle with myself and kinder to myself. Amazing,
And
amazing.
doesn't that, because I was about to ask you, what do you think the impact has been of that group? And you've just given a really great example of when someone next experiences imposter syndrome, which they will, how they can have a bit more self-compassion and just think about it a little bit differently. So are there any other examples that you want to share where you can see actually investing that time in creating a group like that and creating the space for people to be able to talk about really important topics?
Yeah, we talked about, so last month we talked about time, and it was everyone was talking really freely about how hybrid working has changed their approach, and some people would be fixated with 9 to 5 in the past, and now they're how they approach it differently, and their relationships with their families and spouses has changed, and how that impacts on work. So all of these conversations that just blossom from
Mm.
one individual topic, you just sit back for an hour and just let everyone and encourage everyone to talk, and it's a wonderful thing. It really is, and it is a men's group, so you have. And you can see the momentum growing and the confidence growing in the group now, where they feel comfortable in the environment. There's no one's going to be judged. We're all we're all on the same, we're on the same page metaphorically.
Mm.
And yeah, it's working really well, and we're considering expanding it northwest Manchester to bring anyone else who wants to be involved, and just see where that takes us.
And I'm hoping, Nick, with people like you in the space, so in your industry, and I spoke a number of months ago with Stuart Codling, who's Chief Inspector of Thames Valley Police, on an episode of this podcast. So I'll put the link in the show notes. But he was talking about men's mental health and a group he was setting up. And there are some prominent figures now, people who have influence in their industry who get this and are setting up different ways of having conversations, different ways for men to engage, and actually having quite a big impact. And I think it's really important hearing the stories of like yourself and Stuart and other people who are challenging what typically are, can be seen as quite alpha industries, and might be male dominated, and it's a stiff upper lip and so on. And I think actually to be able to have people like yourself saying actually things can be different, and it doesn't, it's quite achievable what you're describing, and it has a big impact. And I think that's the stuff that we need to hear more to help people in that generation, that slightly older generation, think differently.
Yeah, yeah, it is achievable. To get engagement, it's about word of mouth. I've got people coming up to me, saying, "Oh, I haven't been to your group yet, but I'm going to come to the next one." It's clear that people in the industry are talking about the group, and it will grow organically. Which is what we wanted from the beginning. We didn't want to put any pressure on. It really is. Here we are. If you want to come, come. If you don't want to come, don't come. It doesn't matter either way. We're here. If you ever want to jump in, just come along, and that seems to be working.
So, what would be your advice, Nick, for leaders listening to this conversation in terms of what they should be going and thinking about or doing differently for mental health well-being in their organisation?
I think the most important thing is understanding your generations. I'm, a bit of a generational obsessive, and understanding the way different generations work and the way different generations think. The older generation, they need a lot more time. They need a gentler approach. They need what we talked about before, for businesses to engage with it at the leadership top end of that older generation. They need to see the bottom line is affected by that level of engagement. Youngsters, the next generations coming through, will demand visible action and engagement. They'll need to see that. If you want your business to be successful, you need to understand that there is a generation that's here and now that demands engagement at that level. Budget is hugely important. You need to talk to your accountants and your financial controllers so they understand exactly what level of budget is required for training, engagement, what HR will need from you. And finally, I'd say the top of the conversational agenda is in appraisals. I was encouraging the bar conference, when you're dealing with appraisals or practice management reviews with barristers, for example, try and push mental health to the top of the agenda. So your first question is, how are you feeling? How are you? And then everything else will follow.
Yeah, and when you ask that question, pausing and then actually making sure that what you're seeing or hearing is matching. It's like actually when people say, "Yeah, I'm fine, thanks," and there's some people, right, I've ticked that off my agenda. I can now move on to the proper business. It's like no. It goes back to what you were saying about really listening.
Yeah, and it's not trying to turn it into a counselling session. It's how are you? Is there anything that's going on with you? Is there anything you want to talk about? and trying to encourage that conversation so the individual involved feels cared about and engaged with.
And the thing I love about everything you said today, Nick, is it's not rocket science in terms of it's not this stuff that's really complicated to get our heads around or really expensive to try and resource it. It's about being human, and it's, you know, that lovely example you've just given about appraisals is about is having good conversations and just it's connecting with each other and showing that you care. And if we all did a bit more of that, then the world would be a very different place.
Yeah, and it's with just going back to appraisals. It's not. I used to look at appraisals and they'd say you've got an hour or you've got half an hour or 45 minutes or whatever. You can't put a time period on appraisals. You just need to say it'll finish when it finishes and accept that, especially the big ones. When you go into a new organisation, I went into an organisation and there was a lot of issues that needed unpicking, and I had to appraise about 50 people. And I said to the senior leaders, I said, this is going to take me months and months and months, and you have got to get on board with that conversation, because the ultimate benefit will be you'll have a far more engaged workforce. And it worked. It took time, but it worked, and they were willing to give me that time to engage with the people, and it worked really well.
Nick, it has been awesome talking to you today. I'm so glad I got you on. I was right to say, right, I need to meet you. I need to talk to you on this podcast. Never met you before, but I was promised you'd be awesome, and you have been. So thank you so very much for joining me today.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. What have you taken from it? What has it inspired you to think about or do differently? Please give the podcast a simple thumbs up on Apple or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I'd be especially grateful if you leave a short review. It makes a real difference. If you join the club, you'll be the first to hear about relevant updates and free downloadable resources that are part of developing practice and performance. Do reach out to me directly to discuss your challenges at work. And if we're not already acquainted on LinkedIn, let's connect. All the links you need are in the show notes. Until next time, bye for now.